It's easy to remember John Lennon as a man of peace, love, and poetic words, but behind that calm exterior burned a fierce spirit that didn't shy away from rivalry or criticism. While the world adored him as the voice of hope, Lennon quietly carried sharp opinions about some of the most famous musicians in history. He never hesitated to speak his mind, and when he disliked someone's music, the whole world heard about it. These weren't small disagreements. They were clashes that helped define the sound of an era. Today, on Legend Uncovered, we reveal the 5 artists and bands John Lennon secretly, and sometimes very publicly, couldn't stand. 1. The Rolling Stones. Few rivalries in music history are as legendary as the one between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The media loved to paint them as opposites. The Beatles were the charming pop icons, while the Stones were the wild, rebellious bad boys. In truth, they were friends who often crossed paths, but Lennon never stopped teasing them for being copycats. He respected them as musicians, but couldn't resist reminding everyone that, in his view, the Beatles were always one step ahead. In interviews, he openly claimed that everything the Stones did came 6 months after the Beatles. And he wasn't joking. When the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Stones followed with their psychedelic album Their Satanic Majesty's Request, something Lennon saw as a weaker imitation. Even when it came to spirituality, Lennon noticed the same pattern. The Beatles traveled to India to study with the Maharishi, and soon after, Mick Jagger showed similar interests. Despite the rivalry, Lennon's feelings weren't pure hatred. It was more like sibling competition. He and McCartney had even written the Stones' early hit, I Want to Be Your Man. But Lennon viewed them as younger brothers chasing after their older siblings' success. In his eyes, the Beatles were the trailblazers and the Stones were the followers. To Lennon, that question of who's better was never up for debate. The Beatles were the leaders, and the Stones would always be playing catch-up. 2. The Beach Boys. While Paul McCartney often praised the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds as a masterpiece that inspired the Sgt. Pepper, Lennon didn't share that admiration. To him, the Beach Boys' sound was too polished, too perfect, and lacked the raw emotion he believed real rock and roll should have. Lennon grew up worshiping the untamed energy of Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Elvis Presley, music that made your heart race and your body move. By contrast, the Beach Boys, under Brian Wilson's perfectionist control, created music that felt like an art project. Beautiful, but lifeless. Lennon once said he didn't want rock music to sound like surfing songs about cars and sunshine. He wanted music that screamed, bled, and felt human. That's why he bristled whenever people claimed the Sgt. Pepper was inspired by Pet Sounds. Lennon didn't want the Beatles' most personal and creative work to be seen as a response to anyone else's. In truth, he saw their music as existing on completely different levels. While the Beach Boys sang of California dreams, Lennon was writing about childhood trauma, loneliness, and self-discovery in songs like Strawberry Fields Forever. Their music was tender and wistful. His was raw and brutally honest. For Lennon, rock music had to come from the gut, not from a carefully tuned harmony. The Beach Boys, in his view, were just too clean, too polished, and too safe for the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. 3. The Bee Gees. By the late 1970s, Lennon had stepped away from the spotlight, living quietly in New York and raising his son Sean. But as he tried to enjoy peace, a new sound was taking over the world, disco. And leading that glittering movement were the Bee Gees. Their high-pitched falsettos, gold chains, and white suits dominated dance floors everywhere. To Lennon, who built his career on real emotion and raw expression, disco represented everything fake and commercial about modern music. He saw it as plastic, perfect on the surface, empty underneath. Lennon had once fallen in love with the primal honesty of Little Richard and Elvis, performers who shouted their hearts out. The Bee Gees, in contrast, sounded like a studio machine, polished by producers until every imperfection was gone. He even said he'd rather be dead than be a Bee Gee, believing that music without soul wasn't life at all. What really infuriated him, though, was the 1978 movie Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which starred the Bee Gees. The film turned his sacred Beatles album into a disco parody, filled with cheap glitz and corny dance numbers. For Lennon, this was personal, a direct insult to the creativity and meaning behind his most beloved work. He saw disco as the death of authenticity, a shiny, soulless product made for profit, not passion. 4. Queen. If there was ever a band that embodied everything Lennon disliked about modern rock, it was Queen. With their operatic arrangements, soaring vocals, and theatrical stage shows, Queen pushed rock into the world of grand spectacle. Millions adored them, but Lennon wasn't among them. To him, their music was overproduced, pompous, and more about performance than emotion. He admired simplicity, songs that told the truth in 3 minutes flat. Queen, on the other hand, created multi-layered anthems like Bohemian Rhapsody, which Lennon probably saw as a clever showpiece rather than genuine art. Lennon's later music, especially on Double Fantasy, reflected a man who had stripped everything down, just voice, guitar, and feeling. While Queen were singing operatic fantasies and dressing like rock royalty, Lennon was writing about love, fatherhood, and redemption. He might have respected Freddie Mercury's stage power, but he likely saw his theatrics as artificial, more Broadway than rock and roll. Lennon had lived through the Beatles' era of spectacle and left it behind. For him, honesty was now the ultimate rebellion, and Queen's dramatic style felt like the opposite of that. All show, no soul. 5. The Grateful Dead, Lennon's final and perhaps most dismissive musical disdain, was reserved for the Grateful Dead and the entire San Francisco psychedelic movement of the late 60s. While the world celebrated the summer of love, Lennon saw it as self-indulgent and lazy. The Beatles' own psychedelic work, like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, was meticulously crafted. Even their weirdness had purpose. But the Grateful Dead's endless 30-minute jams, Lennon thought they were musical chaos. He couldn't stand what he saw as aimless improvisation. In his mind, music needed structure, focus, and craftsmanship. He once said the San Francisco scene wasn't revolutionary, it was sloppy. Lennon had spent his life perfecting songs, rewriting lyrics, and chasing emotional truth. The idea of a band just jamming for half an hour horrified him. To him, it wasn't art, it was laziness disguised as freedom. He also criticized how drugs influenced their music. For the Beatles, LSD opened creative doors in the studio, but for the Dead, Lennon believed it just dulled their edge. He saw their music as the sound of people too high to finish a song. For a man who believed that great art came from discipline and passion, the Grateful Dead represented everything he stood against. In the end, these rivalries weren't just about ego. They revealed Lennon's deep belief in what music should be: honest, emotional, and human. He could be harsh, but that fire was part of what made him a genius. His vision for rock and roll wasn't about perfection or popularity, it was about truth. And that's why his legacy endures long after the noise of rivalry has faded. Because whether he loved or hated another artist, John Lennon always cared about one thing: the soul behind the sound. And that's the untold truth behind Lennon's most shocking musical feuds, only here on Legend Uncovered.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon.